I will try. I know that many of you do not speak English as your native tongue, so I will try to speak slowly. If I start to speak fast, which is I have a tendency to do, just give me the signal to slow down a bit. So tonight's presentation is sort of a culmination of just some ideas that our group and our team has, both myself at the Creative Class Group, my colleague Richard Flora, many of you know, a well-known author who wrote The Rise of the Creative Class. In fact, my relationship with Richard, I always say, is much longer than my relationship with my husband. I actually have known Richard longer than he's known his wife. So I've said that we've been a work couple for almost 15 years now, so it's been a long time. So tonight what I want to talk a little bit about is why place drives innovation. I know that many of you may know that we're developing a course here about the creative city, and this course that we're developing will go in much more detail and the concepts that we're going to discuss tonight. But really, what I'm hoping to do is to get you thinking, maybe raise some interesting questions, and then we'll go from there. And then hopefully there's a nice dialogue at the end. So tonight's presentation is really about this idea of the question of place and where, and that is the question of location. As many of you know, with the advent of technology, there's been many folks that have suggested that place and community, our neighborhoods, the idea of economic geography really doesn't matter, right? That we live in a connected world more so than ever before. The fact that I'm in New York and you guys are in Sao Paulo, we're able to connect through technology, so community really doesn't matter, right? Well, that's what Tom Friedman says. That's what many folks said. Well, if that's the case, then everything in my life's work is kind of down the drain. And so I hope that's not the case, right? So what I'm hoping to talk to you tonight about is the importance of your community, the importance of the place, where you live, and why it's a very important decision. In fact, when we think about place and we think about communities, we tend to think about cities from an economic perspective. The idea that communities help to drive economic prosperity, they're places that we live, it's places where we live and work. But if you think about it, the place you choose to live has a significant impact on your personal happiness as well. Not just your economic prosperity and the pathways to opportunity that are created to you, but also just think about it, your personal happiness. And there's a terrific book by Harvard business professor, his name is Dan Gilbert. He wrote a terrific book called In the Pursuit of Happiness. And in that book, he raises three interesting questions. He says that if you think about it, our happiness is driven by three questions. The first question, which many of you have defined here at Bellas Arts, and that is the question of what, right? The question of the types of skills that you're trying to acquire. So many of you may be thinking about fashion, some of you may be thinking about design, some of you may be thinking, if you're a geek like me, maybe about economics, probably not so. But all of us have this sort of skill set that we're trying to acquire. So the question of what is really important. The second question that he says is a question that perhaps you get a lot from your parents or your significant others, but it's the question of who. It's who you spend your life with, right? The types of people that you may meet socially. It could be the types of people that you work with, right? The types of people that you have in your social networks. And the third question that he suggests is very important, and a question that we don't spend a lot of time thinking about actually, is the question of where and the question of place. And he says, if you really think about it, the place you choose to live, right? The place you choose to live is the most important decision that you will make. It's perhaps more important than the types of skill sets that you make, the types of the career decisions that you make, because frankly, the question of place, the question of where, drives your success with the types of opportunities that you have, the types of people that you'll meet, and the types of social networks that you have, and the types of people that you may work with. So the question of where, the question of place is important. And so I want you to think about this as we go through tonight's presentation. A lot of times as someone who speaks on economics, in fact, I was on a panel before I came here in New York, and we were talking about the global economy. I was talking to 1,500 people who run hotels all over the U.S. And the question that came up to their mind was the question of what's going on in the global economy. What's going on in Brazil? What's going on in China? What's going on in Europe? What's going on in the United States? And actually, perhaps, what I'd like to propose to you is that question is actually probably not the right question. The right type of question that we should be thinking about is the question of what's going on in our local economies, right? And that is to say that if we want to understand if we want to understand the Brazilian economy, we have to think about what's going on in Rio, what's going on in São Paulo, what's going on in Brasilia, because quite frankly, those communities have completely different competitive assets, completely different industries, completely different social sectors, completely different built environments, and with that drives both the creative economy, but it drives the economy at large. So in fact, if we want to think about the collection of the global economy, perhaps it's not the United States versus Brazil versus Canada versus the UK, but perhaps we should be thinking about the global economy as a connection of New York to São Paulo to London to Paris, to Berlin, right? So thinking about the epicenters and the communities, and that's a really important point when we start to think about the idea of a global economy, and particularly so as we think about the creative economy. And that's something that I think many of you are all interested in, right? And many of you are studying at a design and art school like Bella's Arts, the importance of design, the importance of the creative economy. There's been a huge focus, both if we think about what's going on in Brazil in terms of a pathway and maybe outside of this recession, as you move an economy beyond a commodity-based economy, maybe the opportunity is this idea of a creative economy. And if we're looking at a creative economy, that means that we're starting to think about locality. That means that we're actually having to start thinking about what is the ecosystem and the environment. What are the cities like that we're moving to? Because frankly, we're a much more urban world than ever before. So my thesis for tonight is this: in a world driven by creativity and ideas, that place drives innovation, right? And so I have 4 key reasons to share with you tonight. The first is this: we are living through what is perhaps the greatest shift in the economy. That is to say that we've moved from an agricultural-based economy to an industrial-based economy to this idea of a creative economy. Now, in my country, in the United States, we lived through the shift from the industrial to the creative economy in the 1970s and 1980s into the 1990s. You guys are living in the epicenter of it now in Brazil, right? As particularly as we think about how Brazil's economy is going to create a pathway forward. So this idea of a creative economy, not just a knowledge-based economy that Peter Drucker described, but a creative economy. That is an economy that's driven by ideas, an economy that's driven by entrepreneurship, an economy that's driven by design, media, arts, all of the things that many of you care a lot about as being the economic driver. So to give you a sense of the shift of the economy, this is a picture of the United States economy. And I'm using, throughout the presentation, a few charts from the US, partly because it's my context, but partly because the data in the US is really good. And the data here, as we are finding out in our research project, can be a bit of a challenge. But this is the US economy. And what's interesting about the US economy, if you want to understand the shift in the economy, what you can see is the white line is what we call production-based jobs. Those are the jobs that are industrial-based. Those are the factory-based jobs, right? In the heyday of the industrial economy was 6 in 10 jobs. Today in the United States, makes up less than 2 out of 10 jobs. And if you live in a city like I do, I live in New York, right? One of the major creative centers in the world, frankly. Manufacturing jobs now make up less than 100,000 jobs in New York. Now think about that. There are 18 million people that live in the metropolitan area, 9 million people that live in the city, and only 100,000 people are doing industrial-based jobs. That's a significant transformation. The other 2 lines that you see here are the service and the creative sector jobs. Now obviously the creative sector jobs are the jobs that we would like to see create more and more of, because why? They're high paying, right? They're skill-based, right? They create pathways to creating economic value for you and perhaps for business owners and entrepreneurs. And in fact, when we think about the creative jobs are about pay on average about $95,000 US, right? So significant jobs. But with the creative jobs, we see a fast-growing service sector. Those are guys that maybe cut our hair, walk our dogs, my Oswald, right? It could be people that dry clean, people that clean our houses. And because many of you are going to be in the creative-based economy, you have much more discretionary income. So you're buying more services. And as you buy more services, and as industrial-based jobs decline, we're replacing really well-paying industrial-based jobs with service sector jobs. And so what this is creating is that, yes, as we celebrate the rise of the creative economy, tonight you're doing an opening about the creative economy, right? As we celebrate the rise of the creative economy, we have to understand that not only is the creative economy creating great pathways of opportunities, it's also creating great challenges in our cities and great challenges in our communities. And now that we're having a dichotomy effect in our communities, a difference between haves and the have-nots. And that raises a lot of questions for how we solve that going forward. As we think about the creative economy, not surprising, the inputs have changed, right? From technology to the idea that now what drives your economic value, what makes each of you valuable members of the workforce, members of companies and businesses and entrepreneurs, isn't necessarily your physical labor. It's not even necessarily the fact that you are good technologists, but it is the brain power, the human skills that you bring to the economy and that you bring to your work. So the idea that human capital and brain power is so important. So much important that, in fact, if we look at the economic value of skills, I always call this the chart that parents love to see, right? And it's this. In 1972, 6 years before I was born, I'm not that old, but 6 years before I was born, 1972, someone with a bachelor's degree, they earned 22% more than someone who did not. Today, that premium is about 70%. So people on average who have a bachelor's degree, we're not talking even about a postgraduate degree, we're talking about a bachelor's degree, earn 70% more than someone who does not. So again, it is the accumulation of skills that matter. The accumulation of making sure that you're improving your skills constantly where you can stay relevant in the economy today. So again, creativity and innovation, rather than being natural sources driving the economy, this idea of creativity and innovation are the drivers of today's economy. The second point is this. If the economy is shifting, it's being driven by people like you. It's being driven by people that are immersed in arts and design and technology and entrepreneurship, science, healthcare. It's being driven by people that are engaged in innovation. In fact, it's being driven by a group of folks who we call the creative class. Right? The creative class, people who are engaged in thinking for a living. I'd like to say that if my father got paid, my father worked in the oil industry for a long time, for 17 years before he passed away. It was very much an industrial-based, blue-collar type of occupation that he worked in. I grew up in a very small town in East Texas. If my father was a member of the industrial-based economy who got paid to do physical labor, I am absolutely someone who would not survive there and have gotten paid to sort of think for a living, just like many of you. Right? We get paid to think for a living, this idea of the creative class. And if we think about the types of skills that people in the creative class have, there are 4 types of skills. Number 1 is technology, right? It's technology skills. So people that are computer application designers, maybe software application guys. Maybe it's the folks that are fixing our iPhones or our devices once they don't do so well, right? So it's technology skills. It's folks that have arts and culture skills. And in fact, one of the most interesting things about looking at the rise of the economy recently is that if you want to understand what drives economic portfolios, if you believe that all cities and all communities have economic portfolios, just as if you have a stock portfolio, right? One of the portfolios that really matters is arts and culture for communities. And actually, arts and design and media have now not just become a commodity or an amenity that we consume, but have now become an economic driver for many cities. Professional management, and then yes, your professors are creative too, surprisingly, right? Education. If we think about the creative economy, there's 150 million worldwide. In Brazil, it's about 21 million workers, and it's about 20% of the workforce. Here's how Brazil ranks in terms of the percentage of the workforce. You can still see very much some ways to go in terms of the workforce, but you all are contributing to this. The more educated, the more skilled, the more inclined that we are to engage in more education, the higher these numbers increase. If we think about the creative class, here's why it matters. It's 20% of the workforce and growing very fast. But the 20% of the workforce controls 50% of all wages and income. And then if we look at discretionary spending, so that's all the money that we have left over after we pay for everything that matters. Food, housing, healthcare, transportation, all the things that we have to spend to take care of ourselves. All the money that's spent on, dance classes, those new technology gadgets that you may have, the new sneakers that you buy, whatever it may be, however you spend, the new concerts that you go to, however you spend your pastime, that's considered discretionary spending. And so the creative class, people like you, 20% of the workforce controls 70% of all discretionary spending, right? So from an economic perspective, it's important for two reasons. Number one, when we think about the creative class are important for production. For businesses, you are the future. You are the fuel for their enterprises. They want the ideas from you. You're key to driving the economy forward. But also, you're very key to consumption. Right? The creative class is driving consumption. You decide what technology is hot. You decide what sneakers come off the shelves. You decide the next cool vacation spot or the next rise of technology, right? So it is this creative class that really matters. And so much, in fact, a lot of my private work, a lot of my work outside of the university is no longer, I'm still working for cities and communities, but a lot of my work now is for companies. One of my biggest clients right now is Converse sneakers. You guys know Converse, the all-star sneakers, right? Well, they have another geekier brand called Jack Purcell. That's the brand I'm working on because I'm a geek. But Jack Purcell is another very big brand. It's not Converse sneakers. And by the way, I'm not wearing Converse sneakers because frankly, I find them really uncomfortable and they're not my fan. But if when I'm meeting with my client, I always have them on. This is on video, this is great. But Converse sneakers wants to understand how you're spending your money and where you live and how you are building community. So the demographics of the types of skills and the types of people you are and the types of communities you hang out become very important. So if we buy the idea that the economy is shifting, being driven by a rise of a knowledge-based class, the other significant revolution that's happening is the rise of urbanization. And you guys live in one of the world's largest, most urbanized environments, right? Cities are on the rise. 50% of the world's population now lives in cities and metropolitan areas. 60 million people move to cities every year. And then by 2050, 70% of the world's population will live in cities. And what's interesting about the rise in cities is that not while everyone is celebrating, for many urbanists like myself who have studied cities and studied urban development for a really long time, when I was in your shoes and I was sitting in your audience and I was in graduate school, I was studying cities as being a place of problems. Nobody wanted to live in cities. Everybody lived in the suburbs. Cities were the ills. Cities were the problems. And with the rise of this knowledge-based institution, knowledge-based economy, we've seen more people engage and want to move back to cities and back to communities. And so we've seen this rise of the rebirth of cities. And if you can imagine, this change has such an impact on a lot of things. It has an impact on design. It has an impact on ecosystems. It has an impact on urban design. It has an impact on how we consume products and services. It has an impact on sustainability. It has an impact on architecture. Right? This rise of urbanization is massive. In addition, so not only are we sort of moving into the good parts of cities, moving back to downtowns, moving into cities that are rising like New York and London, San Francisco, right? I mean, everyone, how many of you have been to New York? So if you would have went to New York in the 1980s, it was a shithole. It was not a good place. It really wasn't. I always tell my students this, right? We're down in Lower Manhattan, or in Midtown, depending on where I'm teaching the class, particular day of the week. And everyone says, well, New York is fabulous. New York's great, tons of restaurants, it's safe. New York in the 1980s and 1970s was a really crappy place to live. It was crime-ridden. There was lots of homeless people everywhere. It was a dirty city, right? And with the rise of this knowledge-based economy, and frankly, and some interesting policies, we've been able to create rebirth in our cities. And so with the rise of our cities and the rise of our communities, it is one thing to celebrate, but here's the kicker behind this. And this is why I think people like you guys who care about architecture and design and sustainability and all of those concepts, all the stuff that I don't know enough about, which I wish I knew more about, is that most of the growth in our cities is going to happen in slums. It's going to happen in favelas that don't have any planning, that don't have any design, that don't have any zoning, that don't have any environmental plans, that haven't thought about sustainability. And so if you can imagine that if you are the knowledge base, if you are the consumer of cities, but also, frankly, the folks who are going to reshape the way we think about our communities, there's a huge challenge ahead of us to think about our physical built environments. And in fact, some would argue that for so long, the American model of suburbanization, where you get in a car and drive, you guys know this, you have the worst traffic in the world. I say that you guys have worse traffic than Mexico City, and I'm there all the time. You have worse traffic than New York City. But if you can imagine that model of the car, and taking that model of the car and moving it to places like India or China, right? We create massive problems in our urban environments. We have to rethink about an urban model for our communities. And it's going to happen in cities like yours. Right? It's going to happen at schools like yours, thinking about how we reconsume products and services. So cities are the basic platform. If you think about it, that all jobs and economic activity flow from our cities. The great Jane Jacobs, if you want to read a terrific book, you should read The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Most economic geographers, all of the guys who've gotten paid lots of money and become real famous, maybe even won a Nobel Prize like Rob Lucas or Paul Krugman, most of their work really is built off the foundation of Jane Jacobs' work, who wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities. Which basically said if we want to understand all growth, the growth doesn't come from the industrial age economy. It doesn't come from cities and community. It doesn't come, from companies and organizations, but yet it comes from cities. It comes from neighborhoods like this. Right? Imagine that if you want to understand the São Paulo economy, the São Paulo economy as a whole is not just this one large collective, but it's a collective of different districts and different ecosystems. It's what we call a clustering effect. And understanding those ecosystems is really important if you're an entrepreneur. Imagine as an entrepreneur, we spend so much time thinking about the business model of our business. We think about our business plan and our strategy, but very few of us give thought to thinking about the locational strategy, the cluster strategy, the idea of where are we going to set up our business or our operation. That is just as important. So cities are this basic platform. So the fourth point is this, is that if we are seeing a shift in the economy, we are seeing a shift that's driven by the quote-unquote creative class, and if they are living in more urban environments, the key point to understand is that the world is becoming very spiky and clustered. So let me explain to you what I mean by a cluster. If we want to understand the idea of a cluster is this idea of an ecosystem. It's the idea that you and I, my business and your business, this institution and that institution, come together, we share the commons, we share a shared sense of values, a shared set of assets, and that allows us to do two things. It allows us to maintain flexibility, it allows us to be more innovative, and it allows us to be much more competitive. So if you imagine that if you're a major business, a major company, the reason that you want to be in a cluster is because if you're looking for a sense of innovation, as our focus group guys told us today, the entrepreneurship group, that you want to be able to buy goods and services for other entrepreneurs. Small businesses a lot of times do what? They drive innovation. If you're an entrepreneur, the reason that you care about clustering is because it allows you the opportunity to work with other entrepreneurs to make you more innovative, to make you more competitive, but it also allows you to scale. Because my major company may need to buy pencils, and you may be the best innovative pencil maker in the world, and so I buy your pencils, and I buy lots of your pencils, and what does it allow you to do? It allows you to scale. It creates the environment for the hockey stick that we all want to see. So if we are creating these clusters, we're also seeing that we're starting to see concentrations. And I'm going to show you a series of US maps. I'd love to do these for Brazil at some point. But so the creative class is concentrating and clustering on the east and the west coast. You'll notice high concentrations of the purple. You'll also notice that you see purple dots in the middle of the country. Those are college towns. Those are university towns. Right? Universities become a key place for the creative class. You'll notice this chart, which is one of my favorite charts. I call this the Sex and the City chart. Or all the single ladies, whatever you want to call it, right? But this chart's a fun chart. We did this chart around Valentine's Day a couple years ago. And we were interested to look at where all single ladies were living and where all the single men in the United States were living. So I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time we did this. My sister was in Washington, D.C. as well. And I'm a little protective of my younger sister. She was dating all these guys who were complete duds, like kind of losers, right? And she would always say the same thing that if you talk to women who live in New York, everyone says, well, if you live in New York, you live in Washington, D.C., or you live in the East Coast, it's really hard to find a decent date. And so ladies, if you go to the East Coast, it's a numbers question in the United States. All the single ladies live on the East Coast, and all the single men live on the West Coast. And if you want to understand how economics plays a role here, it's this. Most of the industries and occupations, advertising, film, marketing, public relations, public resources, all of those types of industries that tend to be on the East Coast of the United States are dominated by women. They tend to be women-oriented occupations. And a lot of the science and geeky stuff, engineering, science, and technology in the United States tends to be out on the West Coast, and those tend to be dominated by men. So even just by the economics of our industries, our occupations, we start to create this interesting divide socially. This is personality traits. How many of you have ever been to New York and thought New Yorkers are crazy? Well, you're right, the data says it, right? Wow. So there are 5 major personality traits that most personality researchers study. This is from the work of Jason Renthrow at Cambridge University. He looked at the 5 personality traits, and he saw concentrations in what we call hot zones. And what's very interesting is that if you look at the extroverted occupations, you see concentrations in places like Chicago, you see concentrations in places like Atlanta and Miami. If you look at the concentration of people that are open to experience, those people are on the West Coast and tend to be on the Northeast part. If you look at the crazy people, neurotic people, they're all my neighbors, they're all crazy, they all live in New York and upper part of the Rust Belt here. Here's the interesting piece behind this, is that when we look at the extroverted chart and the concentration of people who tend to be more extroverted and socially engaged, the highest concentration of marketing and sales professionals are in Chicago, the highest Chicago and Atlanta, and the highest concentration of hospitality workers in the United States. Those are people that get paid to be nice to you, right? Because that's their job, are in Miami, right? So people that tend to be in those occupations tend to be very much more extroverted. When you look at the concentrations of people who are in the quote-unquote creative class, if you remember I showed you that creative map and you saw the purple in the east and the purple in the west, people that tend to be a part of the creative class tend to be much more open to experience. Because experiences shape your ideology, it shapes your skills, it shapes your experiences, and it's important to who you are. So this idea of the concentration of skills as well. Now, I can show you a litany of maps over and over. I could show you the concentration of gay and lesbian people. I can show you the concentration of African Americans. I can show you the concentration of Brazilians in New York. That would be a fun chart. We should do that, right? I can show you the concentration of startup capital, venture capital. Here's the world's concentration of the world's rich in the world. The point is that in addition to technology being more connected, we're also sorting ourselves like never before. We're creating these sorting patterns, right? So like people and like institutions are in the same types of communities. They're creating connections, because if you go back to the point I mentioned earlier, place matters. This is San Francisco. It's not a very good chart, but even in San Francisco, what's interesting in San Francisco and other major metropolitan cities, and I could do this probably, if we had the data, we could do this for Sao Paulo as well, what you would see is that the creative class and the wealthy live in one part of the city, the service sector lives in another part of the city, and the working sector lives in another part of the city. And so we're absolutely sorting ourselves, right? And more so in some cities, like my city. I live in Essex County, right outside of New York. We just bought a house there. What's the most interesting thing about Essex County? It is where Newark, New Jersey is built. It's right outside of New York. It is the highest median income in New Jersey. One of the highest median incomes in New Jersey. It also has some of the highest levels of poverty in the entire United States. And 2 miles from my house, I went to vote because I'm here. I was here this week and I wanted to be a good American and vote in the New Jersey primary, so I went to the courthouse. And from my house, in a wonderful community, less than 2 miles to the courthouse, is the most concentrated pockets of poverty that you would ever see. And what is interesting is that when you look at our typology of our cities, we're seeing concentrated pockets of poverty right by concentrated pockets of advantage. And it's creating this friction effect, right? And so when you watch the riots, and you watch the riots that happened in Baltimore, you watch the riots that happened in a place like Ferguson, you watch the riots that have happened in places like your country, and places in Europe, and et cetera. Yes, those are socially driven, a lot of them, but economics plays a huge role there as well, right? It's about the pathways for opportunity. It's about creating economic pathways, particularly as we become much more skilled, that if you don't have the skills to participate in the economy, you get left behind. And if you get left behind, the economic pathway becomes much more challenging. So the review. Living through the greatest shift, driven by the creative class, in a much more urban environment, clustering both economically and socially. Our cities are clustering, our skills of our cities are clustering. And moreover, we're also seeing this concentrated clustering within our communities. So even in the downturn of the economy, folks suggested, well, this whole idea of economic geography will go away, it won't matter. But in fact, what it has done is actually made it much more important to be in an ecosystem that matters. So what does this mean for Brazil? Well, I think if you think about the pathway forward, and you're trying to think about a transition from a commodity-based economy to a knowledge-based economy, what we know is that if you're looking to build an economic strategy forward, there are 4 things that matter. Communities and cities and countries, this is the basic of everything we tell our clients. In fact, I'm delivering next week a report about the Miami economy. Richard and I wrote a piece together that was like hundreds and hundreds of revisions. So like if you have a professor that makes you want to revise over and over, you get to them and you want to choke them. Even my mentor, who I've worked with for 20 years, we were like, it's 100 revisions, and I'm like, stop the revisions. Right? Even as a professor, you start to hate the revisions as well. But we're renovating, we're issuing this report in Miami next week, and it's based around these 4 ideas. That communities have to be innovative places, they have to have technology sectors, they have to have skilled labor forces, particularly skilled labor forces that connect to the creative economy, And they have to be places that are open and tolerant and diverse, that diversity matters. And in fact, inclusion is really important. The people environment matters. In fact, when I get asked all the time, so what are millennials looking for in communities? That's my favorite question. As a Generation Xer, first of all, I'm very bitter against millennials because I'm the forgotten generation. The X and Ys are so it's baby boomers and millennials. That's all everybody cares about. Xers and Ys, we get left behind. And I'm very bitter about it. So everyone's asked the question, well, what are baby boomers looking for and what are millennials looking for? You guys, all you millennials, what are you looking for in communities? Well, we know millennials, and so the question I always say, the most important thing that millennials are looking for in communities is communities where they can be themselves. Number one reason. And in fact, well, here's the most interesting thing. When we surveyed 27,000 people with the Gallup organization, and we asked people, who are the one group of people that you don't want living in your neighborhood? Who are they? Young people was the answer. You guys are rowdy. You cause lots of problems. So there's this interesting thing about this idea that communities want to create opportunities to attract, bring gain, to bring people like you into the communities. But it's this interesting thing they're saying, well, we don't want challenges that young people create. What's actually interesting is that young millennials and baby boomers, two generations, the two largest segments of our population now, actually want the same thing in communities. I love it. You've got all these retirees hanging out with all these college students. It's kind of an interesting situation, right? And in fact, the AARP, which is an association of retired people in the United States, I'm not sure if you have that here, released an index of the top places for retirees. They were all college towns, right? Baby boomers and millennials want open environments, but they also want environments that have great sense of amenities. So how does Brazil rank on the creativity index really quickly, because I know we want to get to some questions. The technology. So let me say this, as I present this, I think what you'll notice is that there's great opportunity for growth and opportunity in Brazil as we think about the creative economy. Technology, Brazil is 27th in the world in terms of its technology cluster. If we look at talent and human capital, we have a long way to go. We're 68th. This is out of 84 countries, by the way. The end is 84. So we have a long way to go in becoming much more skilled. If we look at tolerance and diversity, you're 15th, though. It's a great place to be, a place where you can be yourselves, right? So you can even see very consistent with the places of the US, Denmark, which is a terrific place if you've ever been. One of my favorite places to visit. So in terms of tolerance, if we look at the overall creativity index score, 29 out of 84. Not at the complete bottom, but a ways to go, right? And much of that's going to happen with more and more people like yourselves becoming much more skilled, right? And your kids becoming more skilled, and their kids becoming more skilled. Creating those pathways, those opportunities to pathways, we start to correct some of those questions. So I have a list of best practices. How are we on time? We good? We're finished. 5 minutes. So I've got a list of best practices. I won't run through them really quickly. What I do want to show you is the last slide in my presentation. I'll post this presentation. We'll make it available. I'll send it, and you guys can download it and make it available. So I'm not going to go through this. But what I do want to show you is this last slide. I have 5 minutes. So coming back to how all this relates to you, is that if you are thinking about, you all are in your postgraduate years, perhaps you're thinking about making a location decision, maybe you're starting to think about, this guy's got some stuff that maybe makes sense, maybe he knows what he's talking about, that would be kind of cool. There are 5 things that matter for you as you think about these ideas, as you make a location decision. And I just want to talk about those briefly. We surveyed 27,000 people with the Gallup organization, the same survey that I mentioned earlier. We asked them, what were the things that matter the most to you as you think about your success in your community? And here's the things that matter the most. Number 1 is that you have to find a place that has the right types of basic services. That's everything from infrastructure to safety, right, to good schools. So basic services matter. The second thing that matters is opportunity, right? As you think about your city and your location choice, you have to think about, does your skill set match with the skill set of that particular city? My favorite example is this, is I have one of my closest friends in the world decided he was going to move to Chicago. He's an aerospace engineer. Note to less, there's no aerospace industry in Chicago. He's now a financial planner, right? So your skills have to match up and have to create the same opportunity that the city that you live in. So that's why understanding these factors matter to you, right? Even if you don't care about cities, being educated about being able to make these decisions are important. So opportunity matters. The other thing that it matters is not only the economic opportunity, which is what we tend to care about a lot, but social opportunity matters as well. Right? Can you find a community that you can connect into? Right? Particularly if you're looking for a certain type of community. Right? My husband and I, we looked at, when we made location decisions, having a community that had a strong gay and lesbian population was very important to us. Right? When I was looking for a place outside of New York City, and we're looking, because we're thinking about having kids, we wanted a place that had a lot of other same-sex couples. Opportunity to connect with those people, because that opportunity thing is important, both socially and economically is important. Leadership matters. Cities have to have great leadership. And I know in a time when you're going through a political crisis in a city, I have one too, his name's Donald Trump, by the way, right? I'd take your situation over President Trump. Say that again, President Trump, can you imagine? I can't imagine. But it's a real possibility. It's a real possibility. As I think about President Trump, I always think about the guy who ran, I think about the president of the Hunger Games. You know, the guy who's like the president. That's what it feels like. I'm like, is he going to take us, someone from each city and like make us do? But leadership matters. And the point about leadership is this, is that a lot of times we tend to focus on political leadership, but active civic leadership matters as well, right? So it's not just leadership at the national and the federal level, but it's your community leadership. You guys have a terrific mayor here. However you view him. He's made a lot of different progress this year. A lot of folks in my space sort of see him as a model for emerging cities and doing some things good and some things not so good, but you've got someone who seems to care, right? So leadership matters. Values is very important, right? The community that you live in reflects who you are. It reflects your values.